Welcome to the Unstressed Exec, the podcast where we dive deep into the real conversations that help you lead, love, and live with greater clarity, courage, and calm. I'm your host, Dr. George Vergolias, executive coach and clinical forensic psychologist, and I help high-achieving professionals navigate life transitions, resolve conflict with confidence, and build unshakable psychological resilience. So if you're ready to lead with purpose, master conflict with grace, and become more emotionally agile under pressure, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Welcome back to the Unstressed Exec, where we talk about how to perform, lead, and live with clarity, calm, and confidence, even when life like it's coming apart at the seams. I'm your host, Dr. George Vergolias, forensic psychologist, executive and resilience coach, and someone who has spent decades studying how the mind, the body, and behavior intersect in real relationships, real workplaces, and real lives. Before we dive in, a quick reminder. If these conversations resonate with you and you want practical tools to apply what you're learning, check out my workbook, The Conflict Whisperer, From Conflict to Clarity. It's a no BS, clinically grounded guide designed to help you spot manipulation early, regulate your responses, and protect your clarity. You can find it on Amazon, and I'll drop a link in the show notes. Okay, today's topic. We're going deep on one of the most underdiagnosed and most costly nervous system responses in high-performing professionals. So if you're a high-performing professional, and that could be in so many industries, right? A budding executive, an existing executive, experienced executive, working in AI or IT, working in medicine, healthcare, legal, whatever it may be. If you find yourself as a high-performing professional, this episode is for you. We've talked on this show about fight, flight, and freeze. But there is a fourth response that doesn't get nearly enough clinical attention, particularly in leadership and entrepreneurial contexts. And it may be the one that is quietly driving more burnout, more resentment, and more identity erosion than any of the other three combined. And it's called the Fawn response. And today we're going to break it down completely and give you tools to be aware of this and execute on it in meaningful ways to change it for the better. This episode is called The Fawn Response: Why High Achievers and People Please Their Way to Burnout. What is the Fawn response? Well, first, we have to define this. So the term fawn as a trauma and stress response was first articulated by therapist Pete Walker in his work on complex PTSD. And the concept has since been integrated into broader nervous system and attachment research. Here's the core idea behind it. When a person receives a threat, or rather perceives a threat, particularly a relational threat like disapproval, anger, rejection, or abandonment, and their nervous system determines that fighting back or fleeing isn't safe, it activates a different survival strategy: appeasement, compliance, making the threat go away by becoming whatever the threatener person needs you to be. We see this quite often in children who are in volatile or abusive homes. Typically, if there's more than one child will be the conflict child. They will fight back, or they will defend the abused parent, often a woman or a mother. Not always, but often. It's not uncommon for another child to develop the fawn response, where they cower, or they appease, or they comply in order to avoid the threat or the abuser's wrath is what they're doing. But there's other ways that this emerges in corporate America with high-achieving professionals. In its most acute form, you see this in trauma survivors who learned as children that the safest response to an unpredictable or threatening caregiver was to become hyper-attuned to that person's emotional state and adapt accordingly. So they could read the behavioral cues, they could read the room, and they would know that this is going down soon. To read the room perfectly is what their goal is, to smooth things over, to never be the cause of disruption. In adulthood, the fawn response looks like a chronic people-pleasing, difficulty saying no, over-apologizing, compulsively helping even when it costs you, difficulty identifying your own needs because you're so focused on others, and a deep, often unconscious fear that if you disappoint someone, something catastrophic will happen. In adulthood, the fawn response looks like this: chronic people pleasing, difficulty saying no, over apologizing, compulsively helping even when it costs you, difficulty identifying your own needs because you're so focused on others' needs, and a deep, often unconscious fear that if you disappoint someone, something catastrophic will happen. In high achievers, it often wears a very respectable disguise because it looks like reliability, like being a team player, like strong interpersonal skills, like emotional intelligence. And it absolutely can be all of those things in healthy doses and when it's a genuine expression. The difference is in whether these behaviors come from values and choice or from fear of what happens if you don't behave that way, if you don't appease or comply with the other person. High achievers are disproportionately selected for fawn-adjacent behaviors because those behaviors tend to produce short-term success in professional environments. Being agreeable, accommodating, anticipating others' needs, avoiding conflict, always being the person who holds things together. These traits get rewarded in corporate America, typically. They get you promoted. They build teams. They increase likability, which is a huge predictor of promotion. And they also build teams that people want to be a part of. They make you indispensable, essentially. The problem is they do all of these things until they don't. The tipping point usually arrives when the external demands keep scaling and the internal reserves, your ability to keep this going, does not keep scaling. When the person who never says no has said yes to everything for long enough that there's nothing left. When the person who is everybody's stabilizer hasn't been stabilized by anyone. When the person who built their professional identity around being reliable, capable, and accommodating wakes up one day and has no idea what they actually want. In a way, they have no idea who they are. That's not a productivity problem. That's not a time management issue. That is a nervous system that has been running on fear-based compliance for so long that it has lost contact with authentic presence. Let me now dive into the neuroscience of fawning so we can kind of understand really what is your brain and nervous system doing when you're in one of these states. So this is really what's happening. The fawn response is mediated by the social engagement system, what polyvagal theorist Stephen Porges calls the ventral vagal complex. It's a big term, but what it is, it's part of the autonomic system. The part of the autonomic nervous system that governs social connection, facial expression, tone of voice, and relational attunement. In healthy functioning, this system operates from safety. You connect because you generally want to, because it's pleasurable and meaningful and safe to do so. Yet in the fawn response, the social engagement system is co-opted by threat. The body is using relational tools like warmth, agreeableness, compliance, and those look good on the surface, but the body is using them as a defense strategy rather than an authentic expression. And at a neurological level, this is exhausting in a way that genuine social engagement is not. In a way that genuine social engagement builds and replenishes our energy, constantly engaging in the fawn response exhausts and depletes our energy, although both may look similar at the surface level to the other person. And the reason is you are performing connection as a survival mechanism, and survival mechanisms are metabolically expensive. Over time, sustained fawning is associated with elevated cortisol, suppressed immune function, increased risk anxiety and depression, and a progressive dissociation from your own emotional experience. You actually get cut off from your own sense of authenticity. You might be finding yourself looking in the mirror one night and asking, who am I? Or who have I become? There's an old movie called Wall Street with Charlie Sheen as a young up-and-coming Wall Street exec. At one point, after achieving and making a ton of money and being successful, he's got the penthouse, he's got the woman, he's got the money. He finds himself one night looking out over his penthouse balcony and just asking himself, who am I? It's kind of cheesy and it's a 1980s movie, but What's interesting is that this is a similar type of thing. And the reason is because if you've spent years subordinating your own feelings to manage others' feelings, your access to your own interior life becomes genuinely impaired. You stop knowing what you feel. You stop knowing what you want. And that is a profoundly disorienting place to be for someone who is otherwise highly competent. So now that you know the neuroscience behind it, the next step is recognizing fawn patterns in your own behavior so you can have awareness, you can catch them, and only then can you do something to intervene and deal with them. Let me give you some specific behavior markers to look for. These are patterns I see consistently in my coaching clients who are operating in a chronic fawn state. You find it genuinely difficult to identify what you want in a given situation before checking what others want. So you're constantly checking in with them, and only then do you get clarity of what you think you want, because it's reactive to the situation. There's a really interesting scene in the movie Runaway Bride with Richard Gere and I think it's Juliette Lewis. I might be getting that wrong. Anyways, you know what I'm talking about. And Richard Gere is interviewing her because she has run away at the altar like 4 or 5 times in a row. And she got kind of a social reputation about this. So as an interesting social piece, he's interviewing her about this. And he also is interviewing all the men, the grooms that she left at the altar. Hence the title of the movie, Runaway Bride. And what he asks each man, each groom, is how did she like her eggs? And each one said, oh, she liked her eggs the way I did, scrambled. And the next guy, oh yeah, she liked her eggs the way I did, over easy. And the next guy, oh yeah, she liked her eggs the way I do, with salsa on a tortilla. And then when he interviewed her, he called her out on this. He's like, that's part of the problem. But then he called her out at some point and he basically said, that's the problem. You don't know what you want. You are constantly reacting to the environment around you and trying to become what other people want you to be. This is similar to the fawn response, right? We have trouble understanding our desires as an authentic self because we're constantly trying to please others. The fawn response itself is specific towards reducing conflict or reducing threat. But we also do this to reduce another internal kind of threat, which is a threat of being disliked. And so we sabotage our own authenticity in order to be liked by the other. So another thing that you might find is that you over-explain, you over-justify, or you pre-apologize when making requests or setting limits. The boundary comes wrapped in so much packaging that it barely lands. So you set a boundary, but you're over-apologetic about it. And what ends up happening is the person hears a lot more of the apology, which makes you look weak, than they actually hear the boundary, when the boundary is the one that they need to hear loud and clear. Another example is you experience anxiety or guilt that is disproportionate to the situation when you disappoint someone, even in minor low-stakes contexts. So you let somebody down. Maybe you have to cancel on something, but you cancel on them because your child is sick. That's a good reason to cancel a dinner plan. Your child is literally sick. And let's say they're a 4-year-old, right? You're not going to leave them home alone, or maybe even leave them alone with your spouse because there's several other kids that need to be attended to. And you apologize, but you over apologize as if this was some major social faux pas that you engaged in. You have a strong internal critic that activates specifically around social performance. Did I say the wrong thing? Did I come across badly? Are they upset with me? How did I act last night? Was I rude to anybody? So that internal critic constantly assumes that you upset people or you did something bad. Another, you are often the person who de-escalates conflict and smooths tensions and holds the relational space together, but rarely the person whose own tensions get smoothed by others. Another way to think of this one is you're constantly making the peace, even when the peace isn't yours to make. So if you find yourself in a team meeting, a board meeting, and 2 people are kind of going at it and the tension is building, if you feel like you're crawling out of your skin, or further, you even act on this to step in and be Switzerland and try to make the peace. You might want to ask yourself, are you engaging in some of this? And maybe look for some of these other indicators, because that is a classic sign of somebody. It's one thing to want to make the peace when you're part of the conflict and you're choosing peace. That's authenticity. It's another when it's not your conflict and you want to step in and try to make it, and you feel some urge or tendency to do so. At least it's worth asking the question. Another, you notice a pattern of resentment that builds beneath the helpfulness, a quiet, accumulating sense that you give more than you get, that your needs are invisible, or that your generosity is taken for granted. That resentment is the signal. It is the nervous system communicating that the compliance that you're engaging in is costing more than it's earning. The ROI is not there, and it deserves your attention. So what do you do about it? Well, let's move on to talk about the path out of this, from compliance to choice. Recovery from chronic fawning is not about becoming selfish or difficult or withholding. It's about moving from fear-based compliance to value-based choice. I think that is a critical distinction, moving from fear-based compliance to values-based choice. And that shift happens through specific, deliberate practices. And I'm going to go through 4 of those right now. The first, develop what I call simply the pause. Before agreeing to something, pause. Even just 5 seconds. The fawn response is fastest. It fires before you're consciously processed what you actually want to say yes to or no to. Another way to say it is the fawn response runs around the world twice before your frontal lobes could even get its shoes on. So you have to learn to pause before saying yes, because the pause interrupts that automatically and it creates space for genuine preference to surface. It gives your frontal lobes an extra second or 2 to catch up and get in the game before you're reacting just out of old emotional patterns and nervous system reactivity. Number 2, build a connection to your own body. What I mean here is people pleasers are often highly attuned to the emotional states of others and significantly less attuned to their own physical or somatic experience. Regular body-based practices like breath work, movement, body scanning, which is kind of a certain meditative approach that I've talked about in prior episodes, these rebuild the neural pathways that connect you to your own interior signals. Your body and what's going on with it in these moments, that's your fire alarm. You need to listen to it. But to listen to it, you have to be attuned to it. And that takes a little bit of work if you've not been doing that for years and years. Your body has preferences. It tells you through constriction, through tension, through the gut response that precedes conscious thought. It actually is sending you signals about the interaction that's going on. Learning to hear those signals is really foundational. As I've said in other work and in my workbook, I have a whole chapter that talks about the pause, and it talks about meditative practices that can help you do that. I highly recommend checking that out on Amazon. Third, distinguish your values from your fears. Ask yourself this: if there were 0 social consequences to saying no right now, what would I actually choose? Another way to frame that question: if there was no risk right now of me saying no, what would I choose? That question separates authentic generosity from fear-based compliance. Sometimes the answer will be that you generally want to help, and that's real, and that's good. Sometimes the answer will reveal that you're operating from dread, not desire, and that's problematic. Knowing the difference is doing the work to figure out what's my body saying. When my brain catches up, what is it saying? And am I acting out of authenticity or am I acting out of a fear response? And fourth, practice tolerating disappointment in others. And I'm going to add another caveat to this one. Practice feeling uncomfortable emotion. It's just uncomfortable emotion. You're not going to die. The core fear driving the fawn response is that someone's disappointment or displeasure will be catastrophic. They're going to cut off the relationship. They're going to break up with me. They're never going to talk to me again. They're going to disown me. They're going to kick me out of their will. That's all bullshit. graduated exposure to that discomfort, beginning with low stakes situations where you express a real preference or decline a request, that builds neurological tolerance. It builds your capability or your capacity to sit in uncomfortable emotion. And that's key here. The world doesn't end. And only by sitting in that uncomfortable emotion and getting to the end of it, do you realize nobody died. The world didn't end. The relationship is strained, but it's not over. I didn't get fired, right? The relationship often survives. And each iteration teaches your nervous system that disapproval is survivable. It's a key takeaway for that. Okay. We've covered in the last 25 minutes or so, what is a fawn response, kind of operationally defining it. We talked about why high achievers in particular are particularly vulnerable. And I just want to revisit high achievers. High achievers, I don't mean socially, you make a lot of money, you live in a big house. There are plenty of high achievers that live modest means, but they're doing a lot. They're volunteering at Little League Baseball. They're the pastor or they're the deacon at their local church. They're doing other things in the community. These are people that are achieving a lot in their life. This isn't about socioeconomic status or how much money you make. This is about people that get a lot done and hold themselves to high standards. So we talked about how those individuals, high achievers, are particularly vulnerable to the fawn response. We then unpacked the neuroscience of the fawn response, what's going on in your nervous system, in your body, and your brain, how to recognize those patterns in your own behavior. What are the signals to look for? What are the canaries in the coal mine? And then what's the path out? What are 4 techniques you can do to be aware of the fawn response and then begin to kind of correct it, to begin to reorient it to a more authentic way of being? So now I want to offer some closing reflections. High achievers who fawn are some of the most competent, caring, and capable people in any room. And as I said, these are across all socioeconomic levels and across all walks of life and all working environments. The tragedy is not their capacity for care. It's the fact that the care has been redirected toward everyone else at the expense of themselves. You can't lead well from a place of chronic appeasement. Full stop. You cannot build an authentic business from a foundation of fear-based compliance. And you cannot sustain meaningful relationships when the version of yourself showing up is a performance calibrated always to others' comfort rather than to your own truth and authenticity. So the goal is not to stop caring about others. The goal is to care about yourself with the same intelligence and commitment that you bring to everything else in your life. And that's not selfishness. That's finally being as good to yourself as you've been to everyone else. If today's episode resonated and you're ready to continue this work, I invite you to check out my workbook, The Conflict Whisperer, From Conflict to Clarity. It's a practical, no BS guide to rebuilding self-trust, strengthening boundaries, and navigating relationships with clarity instead of fear. It's available now on Amazon, and I'll drop a link in the show notes. And remember, insight without action changes nothing. If you're ready to turn healing into momentum and clarity into confidence, coaching can be the catalyst. Coaching will change you. You can find me at www.theunstressedexec.com or on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube as The Unstressed Exec. Until next time, I'm Dr. George Vergolias. Thanks for listening. And remember, shift happens.